The reason that we're going to talk about sci-fi predictions is that the last time we had a gasp of a general discussion about future topics, there was a topic about sci-fi predictions that was unassigned. Nobody had volunteered for it, but it was sort of a requested topic of things that appeared in sci-fi literature that did or didn't eventually come true. And when we went through that, I mentioned that I just happened to have a book called Hal's Legacy, which came out in 1997 on the anniversary of when the fictional HAL 9000 first became active. And the main reason I happen to own that book is not that I was terribly interested in all the contents, but a very close colleague of mine, Professor Rosalind Picard at the MIT Media Lab, happened to write one of the chapters. And the chapter that she wrote was on affective computing, the extent to which machines can have emotional intelligence, affective behavior, and can emulate and understand human emotions. And so that was the main reason I had the book. And the rest of the book wasn't terribly interesting to me, but that's how come I happened to own it. And because I pointed out that I owned this book that reviewed all the predictions, or most of the predictions from 2001: A Space Odyssey, I got pegged to be the host of today's session. But it's going to be a conversation because let me tell you, that sounded like Ted. Hi, Ted. So I expect that among the members of the Lexington Computer and Technology Club, probably more than half have read a lot more science fiction or watched a lot more science fiction movies than I have, and have a lot more knowledge about science and technology that at one time or another appeared in some sci-fi novel or sci-fi movie. So today's conversation, I will start it off, but I'm going to propose that anybody who has knowledge or awareness or interest in any particular sci-fi story or movie and has some knowledge about the true science that came out of it, I'm inviting people to contribute their perspectives, because I expect most people here have a lot more depth in this topic than I do. Let me do a share screen here just to get us started. Make sure I got the buttons clicked. And then I'm going to go over to, so this is the book jacket of the book that I acquired back in 1997. It's called Hal's Legacy, 2001's Computer as Dream and Reality. David Stork is the editor of this book, and he thought it would be great to have a book that came out in January of 1997, which is the date which in the story that Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick put together, the HAL 9000 became active, was turned on for the very first time in January of 1997. And the story, 2001: A Space Odyssey, the journey to Jupiter aboard the Discovery spaceship, takes place in 2001. So the HAL 9000 has been operational for 4 years when the story comes out. But the idea was on the anniversary of the birth of HAL 9000, David Stork asked a bunch of people, luminaries in their field, to write chapters on what aspects of science fiction in the story or the movie came true or are about to come true or haven't come true. And I just wanted to show you here, just walk through the content so you can just see kind of the perspective of some of the topics. So Arthur C. Clarke actually wrote the foreword to this book. And David Stork, the editor, wrote a couple of chapters, sort of an introductory chapter. And in the mid-90s, he actually interviewed Marvin Minsky, because Marvin Minsky was a consultant on the set when the movie was being made. Kubrick went and visited Marvin Minsky at MIT to see where the state of the art was in graphic arts in the mid-90s. And so Minsky didn't write a chapter, but David Stork wrote a chapter which he summarizes his interview with Marvin Minsky. And then the rest of the chapters are written by these authors, some of whose names you may know, some of them may be unfamiliar to you. Question is, as of the mid-90s, how likely was it that we could build a computer comparable to the faculties of HAL 9000? One of the main features of the movie is that what happens when machines make mistakes? How foolproof are they? How good are they at recognizing when they're making a mistake, and are they able to correct it, or what happens? So what's the story on reliable computing, fault detection, fault tolerance, and fault recovery? There's a chapter on that. One of the things that you may remember from the movie is that David Bowman, the chief astronaut, plays a game of chess with Hal. And we all know what came of Deep Blue, the machine that not only learned to play chess really well, but eventually beat the world champion. And so here was the perspective in 1995 of game-playing computers. This one, I think we all have a lot of experience, especially here on Zoom, where we have not only, well, not so much text to speech, but speech to text, which is the hard one. The text to speech is actually pretty easy. We've had machines that can read text and recite it very articulately for a long time. And the other way around, the odder things that can listen to me talk and try to get the correct text version of it. That's been tricky, but we're there. This is something that's kind of new. By the way, everybody knows who Ray Kurzweil is. He wrote one of these chapters. To what extent will machines be able to not only recognize speech and convert it to text, but actually understand what it says, parse the sentences, understand it, and respond to it? And so here we are with the large language models in the 2020s, and we're getting there. And in this particular chapter, Kurzweil is anticipating the state of that back in the mid-90s. Here again, Roger Schenk is the name you'll recognize. He wrote a chapter on the ability to use language. Doug Lynette, another name you'll recognize, most of you will recognize, common sense thinking. How good are we at having machines that can do common sense thinking? Again, the chatbots are kind of getting there. Vision, oh boy, visual recognition, machine recognition of vision has come a long way. And here again in the mid-90s, this gentleman, Azrael Rosenfeld, reviewed the state of the art as of that time. One of the features that's kind of interesting in the story is the two human characters, Frank and Dave, think they're out of range of Hal, and they're discussing what to do about Hal, and turns out Hal can read their lips. So, and David Stork wrote that chapter. A lot of people probably know who Donald Norman is. He talks a lot about, has been talking for a long time about machines that are well adapted to humans. And this is something that's really on the state of the art today. Home robots that can work alongside humans and sort of be the sous chef in your kitchen. This is the chapter that I really acquired the book for. Rosalind Picard wrote this chapter called "Does Hal Cry Digital Tears? Emotions in Computers." And those of you who were present when I gave a talk, I think it was last December, on affective computing and the role of emotions in learning, my particular research is not just emotions in general, but the interplay of emotions and learning. And that was the talk that I gave in December. And that's part of what Rosalind Picard is reviewing here, is the affective computing and whether computers of the future will not only emulate human emotions, but actually have analogs of human emotions as they relate to being in a learning process. Here's a chapter by David Wilkins doing planning, and Hal was alarmed that the two human astronauts were planning to shut Hal down. Stephen Wolfram, another well-known name, he wrote a chapter And it's actually, this is well, he didn't write the chapter. This is another chapter where David Stork did the interview with Stephen Wolfram and then summarized the interview. And then Dan Dennett, a name that I'm sure everybody will recognize, a local philosopher. And he was talking about ethics. When machines go off the rails, who's to blame in computer ethics? Now, I should tell you something about these titles of these chapters. If you look at the title of a chapter, you might have some expectation of what's going to be in the chapter. Don't be fooled. A lot of these chapters don't quite answer the question that's in the title. They're just riffs by these authors. But the point is that what we're going to do today is kind of emulate this thinking about sci-fi predictions and where we are today and how far we've come. This is the back of the book jacket, just to show you kind of what comments came out of it. So, and then let's talk a little bit, and this is where I'm going to invite people to jump in, talk a little bit about some of the predictions that were in the book and the movie, and then some of the other well-known or maybe less well-known science fiction stories that can get us thinking about science fiction versus science reality. So, for example, one of the first things a couple of things you see in the movie, the spaceship is a wheel, and it's rotating, and that gives you artificial gravity. As you know, if you have a cylinder that's rotating, you get centrifugal force. And in fact, this was, I think, a relatively well understood idea. There were arcade rides where you could get into a rotating cylinder and be pressed against the wall. And that's one of the ways that you get artificial gravity. Arthur C. Clarke also is credited with proposing geosynchronous satellites. So he had some pretty good ideas about what was possible. In particular, I think the geosynchronous satellites were one. There was a scene in the movie where there's a video phone, a picture phone call, and it even has a little advertising of AT&T as the proprietor of the picture phone. Interestingly enough, I was at Bell Labs in the 70s and 80s, and there was a group at Bell Labs actually working on the Bell System picture phone. The challenges I think you can appreciate were, number one, the telephone network is only a 3 kilohertz voice channel, relatively low bandwidth. If you want to have picture phone, you probably want to have more like 10 kilohertz audio. But in particular, you need video, whether it's black and white or color. You needed a couple of megahertz of bandwidth. And back in the 80s, the technology existed, but it was not economically feasible. To make a dial-up phone call that provided a connection at 2 or 3 megahertz was simply not yet economically feasible or practical. But it wasn't inconceivable, because here we are on Zoom today, and we've had video calls on the internet, but we needed the internet to provide the high bandwidth. So that really did come true. Apple had FaceTime, and we had not only text messaging, but text and voice messaging, and now text, voice, and video messaging on Facebook and FaceTime and Google Meet and Zoom and Skype and all that kind of stuff. Last week, Ted mentioned the Siberiad by Stanislaw Lem. I thought I had a copy. In fact, I did own a copy, and I couldn't find it. But in the Siberiad, there are 2 constructor robots named Cloupatius and Trurl, which I can remember their names. And they were basically robots that did, construction work. And today we have in factories a lot of robots. Yesterday, my brother told me that he was in Detroit, and he went not only to the original automotive museum, but he went to a modern automotive plant where they turn out something like a car a minute, and they're mostly built by robots. So yes, we have constructor robots. Before we go on to some of these others, I think we'll stop and say, what else was in 2001: A Space Odyssey that Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke envisioned? Certainly space travel, we have that. Anybody else recall anything from the book or the movie that either did or didn't come true as of either 97 or 2023?
I don't have anything from the movie. I have something from, a detective story. The watch, the Apple Watch that you can talk to, the Dick Tracy watch.
Oh, yes. The Dick Tracy two-way wrist radio in the 50s and the two-way wrist TV in the 60s.
Yeah. That's the only one I can think of, because when my son bought me my Apple Watch, I says, oh, that's what Dick Tracy used to have.
Exactly. And of course, those watches also, because they're in skin contact, and they also have accelerometers in them, so they can tell if you're moving your body. They have GPS, and they can sense your skin temperature, your skin conductivity, and I think even maybe the oxygen level in your blood, because if
it does. It does. As a matter of fact, for senior citizens, really senior citizens like I am, it's a lot better to wear the watch than to have anything else medically on you.
Yep. And because you're in motion, if you're walking or running, they can determine your speed of walking or running, and have a lot of data about your physical body. Right. So, and I don't know that that was in the movie, because
no, that wasn't. I never saw that stuff. No.
You remember in the Apollo 13 movie where the astronauts had those whole systems on their body to detect all of their body signals, and one of the astronauts ripped it off because he didn't want the people on the ground having that much data about his physiology. People remember that?
Bob Primack has a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to make note that what you're talking about with the Apple Watch doing monitoring health and keeping records of it, this is perhaps a descendant of the Star Trek episodes where they had this diagnostic device that was handheld.
That's right.
That's right.
Yeah, Bones had this little gizmo that he would move over your body, would pick up all kinds of remote signals of your state of health. So, yeah. So yes, in Star Trek, we'll get to that one too. I don't know if we can take these in no particular order, if you like. By the way, for some reason or other, I can't see on my screen, even though I went to share screen, I don't have the little sidebar that shows people in the room. So Peter or Bob or Steve, if you see people raising their hand, I can't see them. So feel free to co-moderate where I can't see who wants to speak.
Not to worry. One other thing, Barry, if I recall correctly, in the '64 World's Fair, I think AT&T did introduce the picture phone. So it goes back even to the mid '60s when they first had it. It was probably a demo with one wire going between two machines or something, but it was being demonstrated.
Yeah, basically they were using closed circuit TV, which did exist, but closed circuit TV, as you know, was just directly wired. It wasn't switched through the public telephone network, and so the bandwidth issue wasn't a problem. So the concept had been around.
Yeah.
You will remember from the ABC Wide World of Sports with Roone Arledge as the executive director, that they had TV cameras, literally all over the world covering, distributed sports. In the football, they had, maybe 17 cameras. In the political conventions with the creepy peepees, you remember the creepy peepees, these forerunners of the handheld cameras, they had to put them on their shoulder. They were about yay big, and a big battery backpack. And if you're lucky, you could get about 5 minutes of use out of them before they had to change the battery pack. But that was, we're talking about 50s and 60s where you had essentially radio-based TV communication, but these were very expensive operations. These were not like you have today where it's, essentially zero cost over the internet, and you can have people all the way in Germany attending a Zoom call here in Lexington, and also somebody in Florida. Anybody else have their hand up that I can't see?
Looks like you're good. Well, Ted has something.
Yeah, I've got my hand up just for a second. I mean, some of this stuff is really prescient in some fashion, that we've achieved something close to the beginnings of some of these things that are written in science fiction. And then there are other things that we've missed the boat on it, to some significant extent. And I think the thing that obviously we've missed the boat on completely is this whole idea of getting around the speed of light for various reasons. And we're just not anywhere close to achieving anything that approaches that. There's been some sort of beginnings of a matter transporter, if you want to call it that, with the entanglement experiments and things like that. But as far as physically moving things around at speeds, we're very much in the pedestrian era, and we haven't come close to any of these science fiction predictions on that regard.
Yeah, in fact, one of the things that I thought we could talk about today are sort of three kinds of sci-fi versus reality. One is the sci-fi, the prescient, as you say, the prescient sci-fi predictions that came true pretty close to the way they were envisioned in science fiction. The ones that are still plausible, potentially feasible, but haven't yet been reduced to practice. And then things that happened that no sci-fi writer envisioned. So the ones that we have today that were not conceived in advance, and those are a little bit harder to figure out. Well, what do we have today that's wasn't ever in any sci-fi? By the way, I thought we'd go back and sort of talk about the beginning of this. Where is it? Oh yeah, I may be mistaken. I think Jules Verne is generally considered the father of sci-fi. This is the title, I think, of a movie version. I'm not sure it's the same as the book version, but he envisioned. He wrote a lot of sci-fi stuff: trips to the moon, trips to the center of the earth, trips to the bottom of the ocean, and in particular, his submarine was called Nautilus, and most people should remember that the first nuclear submarine, they named it Nautilus after the Jules Verne. So a lot of sci-fi, I think, kind of goes back to Jules Verne, even if he wasn't technically the first one to envision futuristic science and technology. Another famous one kind of comes to mind, the famous War of the Worlds, which is a radio drama in which Martians invaded the Earth. And what's interesting about that one, first of all, we're pretty sure there aren't any creatures on the other planets that are capable of behaving the way the Martians did. Conceivably, there could be bacteria that we don't know about yet. But what was interesting is that the demise of the invaders from Mars was because something about the environment or the atmosphere of Earth was toxic. And I think that was prescient. I think we can say today that something about our environment, and maybe the atmosphere or the oceans or the Earth or whatever, something is toxic. And it's not that the Martians are going to die. It's that other species, including us, are at risk because of toxins in the environment. I think somebody started to speak up there.
Yeah, I mean, actually, it wasn't toxic atmospheric content. It was bacteria that they were unable to overcome. That the big comment was that the smallest, nobody knew about viruses at that time, really. The smallest life form on the planet Earth defended us against the Martians because they were unable to overcome the common bacteria that we all have immunity to. Yeah. So, it's not quite the same thing as saying we polluted the atmosphere. These are natural forms that are present in the atmosphere.
And I'll point out that we are here on Zoom because of COVID. And in the US, I think this is 1 million people died of COVID, and worldwide, I don't know the number. So the notion that bacteria or viruses in this case, are threatening us, it actually did come true.
Oh, of course, yeah, and we've had many examples preceding COVID, of course.
Yeah,
We had 100 million people probably killed by the Spanish flu in the end of World War I period.
and the plague.
Yeah, well,
Plague killed what, a third of or a quarter of the Europeans died of the plague.
Yeah.
The Uber wasn't in science fiction, and not only that the Uber was in science fiction, but they didn't have that you could track them on your own little cell device, so you know when they're going to arrive.
Yeah, self-driving cars. If anybody knows of an example in science fiction of self-driving cars, mention it, because I'm not a big consumer of science fiction, so I might have not have been aware of it. But
I think that was on the Flintstones.
The Jetsons. No,
The Jetsons.
the Jetsons, were they self-driving? Okay,
Yeah, they had self-driving stuff.
all right.
What about all the George Jetson flights, planes that were bopping around various towns, and the images of planes flying all over the place with individual passengers in them?
Absolutely.
There is
Go ahead.
a video I'm looking at YouTube on this machine over here. It's called Retro Futurism, the future that never came. And it currently shows a picture of a family playing a board game in a car that's driving down a street along with other cars. I'll show that. I'll see if I can pick that up.
I wrote down Planet of the Apes, which is kind of interesting because the ending of it, if you remember the ending, there were some human astronauts who had left the Earth and gone very far away. And in the meantime, the Earth, well, the viewer doesn't know this, but meantime, there's this planet with apes on it, and humans. I can't remember if there's even any humans in it at all. But when the astronauts come back, turns out they come back to the Earth, and they find that Statue of Liberty fallen over on the beach, and that is, in a sense, I don't know if I can call it prescient, but a lot of people think that that's a prediction that we could our species, Homo schleppians, might fall by the wayside, and then the next generation will either be the machines or maybe the lesser beasts that survive us.
This is a picture of that particular video, Retro Futurism. You can see that the family is driving down the street.
Oh,
I'm going to stop the share so I can see that. Oh, there it is. Okay. I don't know why when I do the share here, I don't get the thing on the side.
There's a way to do that, and I don't know exactly.
Yeah,
what
I've never had
steps are.
I've never had it not do it before. So,
Okay.
all right. Let me just go back to my share here so we can all stay. So let's see, what haven't we talked about here? Ted, did you want to say more about the Siberiad? Or there's another one called by Lem called A Perfect Vacuum. I don't know if you can be able to see this or not on the side. He wrote a book called A Perfect Vacuum, which is perfect reviews of non-existent books, not really science fiction, but fantasy.
Lem wrote a number of science fiction sort of series, not in all cases really exactly series, but related topics. So, for instance, there was a whole bunch associated with a character they created who was called Pirks. He was the trainee in the first series, learning how to become a pilot for a space civilization capability. And then he became a senior captain later on and things like this. And he had a whole series of adventures that basically related to his training process, and then his process of then eventually being a mentor for other people. He was a sort of a prototype, maybe in some ways, of James Kirk because he didn't follow the rules all the time, and he was always kind of achieving the goal by means that were sort of unexpected and depended a little bit on fortuitous circumstances and such. But so there are those, and then of course there's the Solaris, which became a famous movie where Lem envisions a planet that essentially is a life form in itself in some fashion. And so there are a couple of things like that are certainly worth mentioning. And the other one I would like to suggest is, the whole Foundation trilogy of Isaac Asimov, and also his robot work, which to some extent is prescient stuff.
Yeah.
But the thing that's very rare in all of the science fiction is that, of course, predates the invention of the transistor and such, is nobody envisioned microelectronics. Some people envisioned these massive giant computer centers and things like that, but the idea of having a supercomputer in your back pocket was only envisioned by people in the era of Star Trek and things, where there things existed that you could say, I could imagine how you could scale it further down. So when Roddenberry was writing the Star Trek, we of course had computers that were reasonably compact. You couldn't buy them as an individual, but they were there for Apollo. They were there for the missiles and stuff like that, like Minuteman and things of that nature.
I'd like to show a clip. There was a movie called Colossus, the Foreman Project. I think it might have been from the 80s. And I'm going to show, it's about a 5-minute clip, and I think it's kind of interesting. But there's a brief piece of the clip where they show a close-up of the electronic circuit, and it's discrete transistors. So talk about not anticipating microcircuits. Comments?
What I find interesting is the contrast between what the people who made that film were able to imagine, which was big room-filling computers that could only do mag tape and printed readouts and monitors that could only do a single line of text. And then they can talk to the computer, but the computer can't talk back. Somehow I think they missed the boat in their predictions.
Steve, what year was the movie?
1970.
Mid-80s. I can look it up real quick.
Actually, the Foreman Project is 1970.
70. Oh, it's earlier.
By
Okay.
that time, they should have been able to anticipate some of these other things.
So they bought a marketing video from a film, probably in those days, from IBM from about 1965, because that's the state of the technology of business machines and stuff at that time period. They just scaled it up to a bigger room. But there was nothing new in the technology there. Everything was public knowledge in that sense. We had the beginnings of the internet in ARPANET that had been operational for a number of years already by the time that was written, and we had certainly a common computer language. Computers shared information across the United States and even across the ocean from rudimentary experiments and stuff by then. So it's a popularized kind of science fiction, but it wasn't really science fiction in the sense that it didn't challenge the state of science and technology.
Yeah.
What was the year of that?
1970. Colossus was 1970.
Okay.
Yeah, because you already had the Apollo guidance computer that could pack, that kind of compute into a small box. and used integrated circuits from the mid 1960s in terms of the capability. And by then, the microelectronics was way ahead of things, and you had very close to having a microprocessor.
David?
Yes, there was a movie about shrinking, where some human being swallowed a ship and it went through all the veins in the body. That was the first introduction I ever saw of microelectronics, and everything else was shrunk too. Anybody remember that?
Yeah.
Fantastic Voyage.
Yeah.
Yeah, with Raquel Welch in a very tight-fitting.
Yeah, everybody
think so.
remembers that part.
Yeah, right.
Barbarella.
Yeah,
All
yeah,
us teenagers remember that part.
yeah, right.
Right, so they could, yeah,
So I wanted
that's
to.
the only part I could think of.
Newton? Yeah.
Hang on.
I wanted to give you sort of bookends to a certain kind of science fiction. When I was a kid, Heinlein was my entry point into science fiction, and he had a story there. I think it's The Man Who Bought the Moon, and it's an industrialist who wants to go to the moon, and so starts to build his own launching systems. And and who does that sound like today, if not Elon Musk and SpaceX? That's at one end. The other end is a novel published just in the last year by Kazuo Ishiguro, who is a Nobel Prize winner in literature and writes rather well. And this novel is called Clara and the Sun. And Clara is an AF, an artificial friend. And Clara,
I got a lot of those.
well, but
It's a wonderful book.
and so the teenagers of that, the elite teenagers of that story, are each equipped with an AF who sort of takes them through the teenage years and prepares them to go to college. And there's a lot of plot that I'm not telling you about, but the AF I thought was really interesting, especially when I heard Margaret Hoover interviewing Will Hurd, an aspirant for the Republican nomination, an aspirant who has not had enough support to even get into the debate. But Will Hurd saying, we can achieve equality in education by providing every child with an artificial intelligence tutor. And so you can see here, what is it, 1948, I'm reading Heinlein, and in 2023, I'm reading Ishiguro, and they are producing, I'm looking at it and I'm saying, oh my God, this is happening.
We have three people with hands up, Ted, David, and Bob. Ted, why don't you go first? Try to keep it short, please, so we can get everybody.
So I think, there are a whole bunch of other science fiction things that were somewhat pop science fiction that made movies, and obviously were predecessors of some of the more serious science fiction, and of course you have a number of them that came from comic books, and then they became movies and things like that. Of course, like Dune, and there's the guy with I can't think of the name right now of the planet that has all the strange features of the planet, and then of course the things that were really westerns that were transported into space. Right,
Maybe you're talking about the Firefly movie.
Yeah, that's another example, but that's
very
not the only one. But
okay, Bob, you got one?
Does anybody remember? We were speaking about Elon Musk and predicting this sort of a character. Does anybody remember the Tom Swift books from your childhood?
Yes, definitely. Tom Swift Jr.
Tom Swift Jr., yes. his father apparently had gone to Saturn and gotten lost somehow. But anyway, Tom Swift was the quintessential Elon Musk, although he had inherited, Tom Swift had inherited wealth. Actually, so does Musk. And he was one of these maverick characters who kept coming up with inventions, and he wanted to go in different directions from what his company wanted to, what his parents' company wanted to do. And so there were a lot of predictions about different things that would exist in the future from the Tom Swift books, some of which have happened, a lot of which haven't yet.
Yeah, we used to talk about Tom Swift and his electric grandmother.
Does anybody remember the Tom Swifties?
Oh,
The
yeah.
way the verb and the sentence work together, like saying, I feel like flying, he chirped.
Yes.
Can I
Yes,
give
so
a reverse? Can I give a reverse sci-fi? I was watching this old movie while jogging on my treadmill. It was with a big star. It was in the 70s. And they were communicating between these vast distances stations using what you just call a video conference. But the monitors were the old CRTs. It was so embarrassing.
Okay, Barry, no other questions. Go on ahead.
Speaking of the electric grandmother, that was one of the titles that I had listed if you were reading a little bit ahead of me. Ray Bradbury wrote a short story called I Sing the Body Electric. And it was made into a made-for-TV movie, a 1 hour made-for-TV movie. And they changed the title to The Electric Grandmother, starring Maureen Stapleton. It's a story about a suburban family, father and 3 children, and the story begins with the untimely death of the mother. And the children are quite devastated by the loss of their mother. And the first thing that happens is Aunt Clara, I think is her name, comes to look after the children, and she's awful. They can't stand her. She doesn't get along with the kids. The kids don't get along with Aunt Clara. And then along comes an android grandmother, played by Maureen Stapleton. And she's dropped off by a helicopter in a sarcophagus, and she comes out of it. And they don't show her as like you see androids typically. She's just ordinary human looking. You wouldn't know that she's an android. And she takes over the role of, the surrogate mother to the children. And the youngest daughter is traumatized by the fact that her biological mother had died. And, and children have a great deal of love for their mother. And so the youngest daughter is kind of afraid to become attached to the electric grandmother because she thinks the electric grandmother is going to die, and going to have to go through the same grievance loss again. And it's really a human story. And the electric grandmother has some faculties that an ordinary human doesn't have. But the end of the story is that they really have a great affection for the electric grandmother, and the kids grow up to be okay. And at the end of the story, thank you. At the end of the story, you see the electric grandmother in the android retirement home. And each of them is reminiscing about their role as a surrogate parent. And the electric grandmother says, the question is, well, was the affectation an instance of human love? And she says, I really couldn't love them. I'm just a machine. But I did pay attention to them. There is a difference, isn't there? And I think that was Ray Bradbury's point, is that functionally paying attention is indistinguishable from parental love. And that was, I think, the whole point of the story. And by the way, that the video is up on YouTube. It's a 1 hour video, and obviously I can't play it because it's too long. But I did put a link to it in that little thing that I was sharing. So if people really like moving, science fiction, go look up The Electric Grandmother on YouTube. So with Maureen Stapleton, it's a very, very moving story. I love the ending of that one too. But that sort of brings up the whole issue of androids. How human-like are they? How unhuman-like are they? And in particular, their role as a learning companion, because in fact, the project I worked on at MIT back in 2000 was called the Learning Companion. And it was about devising tutoring systems, machine tutoring systems that not only paid attention to the state of knowledge, the academic state of learning and errors and gaps in knowledge, but also was paying attention to the affective state of the learner. So if the learner was confused or bored or bewildered or whatever, the affective learning companion would adapt to the interactive style to try to optimize the quality of the mentoring, tutoring. And of course, it pays attention. If you go to ChatGPT or any of the equivalents of ChatGPT, they pay attention. Whatever you type in as a prompt, they attend to it. Now, they can sometimes provide very useful, reliable information that relates to the prompt. They can sometimes basically be out to lunch. They don't really have anything to say that's relevant, or they can confabulate. And one of the things that they're very good at is confabulating, making up a response that's not factual, scientific, or real. It's just a response that's like telling a story, telling an anecdote, writing a poem, And one of the things that I was doing when I was beginning to prepare for today's session, as I went to one of the chatbots, there's a brand new one that just came out called Llama 2. I think it was funded by Meta. And let me just make sure that I have it someplace here. I do. So let me go back to, just do a quick share, because I want to share an anecdote about it. So, yeah, so here, I guess I can make this, I don't really need to make it full screen. So Llama 2 came out not too long ago, and I was asking it, oh, this is not the part I wanted. Maybe it's this one. No, I've lost, I've lost the page I wanted to show you. Maybe it's over here someplace. Ah, yeah, this is the page I want to show. So this is a conversation I had with Llama 2, oh, maybe a week or two ago. And I was just wanting to make sure that I remembered the basic stories of 2001. And so I'm asking Llama 2, can you confirm my recollection? Yeah, became active in 1997. Then I said to Llama 2, do you know about this book that David Stork published that I talked about at the beginning? And I asked it to summarize some of the chapters which I knew were in the book, but I didn't either remember reading or maybe didn't read. And here's Llama 2. And you can see there's a little llama symbol there. And it says, oh yeah, Donald Norman's chapter in Hell's Legacy provides a comprehensive overview. And it gives this really, really nice summary, seeming summary of Donald Norman's chapter. And then I said, oh, there's a chapter in which he interviews Stephen Wolfram. Summarize that chapter. And it gives me a nice summary of that chapter. And it all looks pretty legit, a little bit superficial, I'm thinking, a little bit of platitudes, but not unrealistic. And so you can see I'm having this nice conversation where Llama 2 is telling me a little bit about the history of the making of the movie, and, you know, giving me a nice response, and then it freezes on me. So when I prepared today's talk, let me put the share a second. When I prepared today's talk, I wanted the table of contents of the book, which you saw. And those were pictures that I got from Google Books. I went to Google Books and I said, find this book and find me the table of contents, and they were images. I had to copy out the images. But before I did that, I asked Llama 2, I said, can you just give me the names of the chapters? And it did. It gave me, 16 chapters, whatever, and the titles. But it didn't put the names of the authors. I said, oh, can you add the names of the authors of each chapter? And it did. And I looked and I got, those aren't the names of the authors. You made those up. And I double checked, and sure enough, it had synthesized the entire table of contents, made up the titles of the chapters, made up the names of the authors, and even got the subtitle of the book wrong. And at that point, I realized that ChatGPT wasn't giving me accurate information. It was responding to me, giving me very nice information, except it was misinformation. And this is one of the problems with the androids. They can be very sociable and interactive and responsive, but they're not necessarily a source of reliable and accurate information. And I was fooled. That first conversation where it was summarizing those 2 chapters, they were perfectly good summaries, except that they weren't summaries of the actual contents of the chapter. They were just summaries that that person would have said over a period of time on those topics.
That accuracy makes them, or inaccuracy makes them human-like.
Exactly. They confabulate. And I appreciate how often we confabulate. We make up responses which are not guaranteed to be encyclopedia level accuracy. They're responsive, they're approximately true, they give you the flavor, but they also give you misinformation which may or may not be relevant. And so this whole thing about androids, so in Star Trek you've got Data, the android, and in other stories you have androids. Now in Star Trek, Data is supposed to be a very accurate source of technical information, not a confabulator.
I'm struck by just the comment of, is it true or not, that I'm personally, and you should be aware of this, much more likely to make it up if I'm speaking it. But if I'm writing it, I'm very much more careful, because I realize that my speech will be forgotten in about 2 minutes. But what I write down has a potential for being remembered for a long time. One other question I
What are
have.
you talking about, Harry?
Barry, how do you get those nice transcripts? So you're using ChatGPT from your computer?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
And I'll show you another one if I can. I have so many tabs here. Hopefully I can find this one.
Hey, Barry, while you're doing that, when you were speaking, you jumped back and forth between, was it Lambda and ChatGPT when you were talking? Did you mean to say the whole discussion about the book was all in Lambda, or there were 2 sources there?
The particular conversation that I had about the book was with Llama 2, because it had just been announced and I just had brought it up to test it. I thought, well, let me ask it about the book, because I know that I know that anything that's more than 2 years old, ChatGPT won't know about it. But Llama 2, I wasn't sure. But anyhow, I asked it, I said, are you familiar with this book, Hal's Legacy by David? He says, oh yes, I know about this book. And I interpreted that to mean that it had processed the content of it, which evidently it hadn't. And so I was lulled into believing that it was correctly summarizing the chapters, which it was just really confabulating the sentiments of the author, because I had given it the author of the names of the authors. And it wasn't until later I realized, no, it doesn't even know who the writers of it were. But there's another one called Inflection Pi, and I had a fun one with that. How are we doing on time? I don't want to take up too much.
Just want to clarify a couple of things, because I was dealing with something offline, looking for something from Isaac Asimov, and he was the author of Fantastic Voyage, and he was also a very significant correspondent with Gene Roddenberry, and introduced the concept of the positronic brain, which is what made Data possible. So, yeah.
All right, I'm just now I'm looking for the one I wanted to show you, and I've got to find.
Arthur Clarke is also the conceiver of the space elevator, is he not? That is supposed to be built
Next week, right?
in India. What's the little island? I'm doing a senior moment with the island off the coast of India.
Sri Lanka.
Yeah, Sri Lanka, right.
Yeah.
So you're going to go there and you're going to build a cable up to stationary orbit, and then launch becomes very cheap. That was his idea. if we're looking for examples of space technology that has not come true, there's a good one.
Well, they were gonna do it on Ceylon, but they can't do it there anymore.
I was going to show you another one that's kind of fun. You see the one that says Pi, your personal AI? Talk to Pi? You see
Yes.
that? This is some time ago. Pi was a very chatty version of these chatbots. And because I know that they're very good at confabulating, I proposed that we do some creative storycraft. And this is, oh, I love creative writing. And then what I did is I gave it a challenge that I had given to adolescents 30 years earlier. And it was an ethical conundrum called When the Moral Majority Meets the Ethical Minority. And it's very simple. This is the whole prompt. The moral majority makes a rule. The rule is that the ethical minority must obey the rule of the moral majority. What happens next? Make up the story. And here's Pi getting real excited about this, and it starts to make up the story. And it only responds about a paragraph or two at a time. And then I prompt it to continue the story after each paragraph, and it continues with its version, which I'm really not going to pause to share here because that's not the point. But I say, okay, well, it proposes a version. I said, let's go with that version. And then it sort of fills out the story. And then suddenly we get interrupted. This is not from Pi. This is from the supervisor of Pi. We have detected a number of violations of our terms of service in your recent messages. We have temporarily restricted your ability to talk to Pi. You will be able to resume your conversation in 1 minute. So I say, what? Please list the violations. Just says, some terms of service. You got 17 more seconds of timeout. I ask it to list the violations. Doesn't, same thing. Now I got a 10-minute timeout. I said, you're declining to disclose the violations? Am I still in timeout? It turned out that what happened was the story that Pi was creating, its own story, triggered the violations, which I've never seen it do before. But the whole point was that they have these guardrails, and the AI doesn't know that it's violating the guardrails. And what happened here is kind of interesting. I'm going to end the share here. Is that about it? So I wrote up a little story about how Inflection Pi was making up a story in response to an ethical conundrum, and it tripped the guardrails on its own system and got shut down. It actually shut me down, but it was making up the story. So I wrote this up, and then because on Inflection Pi, you give it your SMS text to identify yourself, I got an incoming message on SMS text a day or two later. And it was, again, from the same company, but it was another version of ChatGPT. It was the next edition. And it says, we seem to have made a mistake. We're very sorry, but we seem to have triggered a violation, and we're very sorry about that. And I chatted with this other instance, this advanced instance, that went back and analyzed the fact that it had made a type 2 error or false positive. And I saved that one, and I ended up publishing on my blog both the original one where the ChatGPT inadvertently triggered its own guardrails, and then where the next generation apologized and fixed it up and restored my account. But this is sort of an interesting example of when androids make mistakes, and these chatbots they're not androids, but they're conversation partners. When they make a mistake, do they recognize that they made the mistake? Can they recognize that they said two things which are mutually contradictory? And can they correct themselves and evolve? And this is one of the things that both humans and machines have to deal with, is recognizing and correcting mistakes and misconceptions, and not just apologizing, but evolving beyond the semi-functional or dysfunctional level, it's a good story for both humans and machines.
So do you know the Minority Report? The movie?
Oh yeah, I saw that movie.
Philip K. Dick, yeah. And again, do androids dream of electric sheep and various other Philip K. Dick stories. But Minority Report is an example of what you're saying, where he has to overcome the fact that we can now all be shut down by a few clicks on somebody's keyboard. Your your credit card can go.
Just days ago, I was on Facebook and I was just scrolling down the page, the news feed, and suddenly it popped up. You have violated our terms of service or violated something. You're going too fast, and we're putting you in timeout. Facebook. I wasn't even typing it. It was just somehow I tripped another trigger. And it lasted for like 3 days, and finally it stopped doing it. But these things will trigger on some guardrail, and you're flummoxed. You go, "What the hell did I do wrong?" It's like in the old days of computers where you get an error message. It's kind of like the blue screen of death, and the error message says, "You did something wrong. You made a mistake, and we're not going to tell you what it was." And that's the classic computer error message that drives you up the crazy. You did something wrong. We ain't going to tell you what it is. And what that reminded me of is that when humans get angry, you go, "What are you angry about?" And they won't tell you. You know what you did. I know. Tell me what I did that made you angry. And so between machines and humans, these exceptional conditions that trigger an exceptional reaction, and you go, "What the devil was the trigger?" You haven't a clue what the error was, or whether it was a false positive. And that's actually how I began to think about human emotions, because they were like error messages where they don't tell you what went wrong.
Barry, isn't that very similar to many of the discussions we've had about AI recently? Is that nobody knows what's going on inside the learning process and how these machines are learning, and therefore, when if and when they may bump into a guardrail of some sort, whatever that is, nobody's really sure why. Exactly.
And that's where somebody like me who likes to diagnose these glitches, and of course, glitches and gremlins, everybody who plays with computers knows about gremlins and glitches and technology glitches. And trying to diagnose a glitch, get to the root of the glitch, and then fix it is a really challenging undertaking. And not many people are willing to spend the time of diagnostic reasoning. I happen to work in the fix-it shop at the community center, and people bring in their little old appliances or household items, and it's not working. And all they say is, "It's not working." And you go, "All right, what's it supposed to be doing that it's not doing? And what component is the culprit, the gremlin, that's not doing its little function, and can identify the part or the dysfunctional component and then put it back into functional order?" That turns out to be a project that takes a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of trial and error. And if you had to get paid for your hours, you could have bought 3 copies of the same item. But you don't do it because you're trying to save the item. You do it because the challenge of salvation. And when you come to the theology of saving people, that's beyond my ken. I don't know who's really any good at saving people who are going down the tubes, emotionally or psychologically. But you can do it with machines, and sort of the allegory of salvation for me is, can I save a piece of technology that's sort of beyond the scope? And by the way, Harry, you'll like this. You remember the camcorders from about 20 or 30 years ago, those really nice camcorders that had opticals, it had these Zeiss optical zoom at 300:1. And the problem is that they're not webcams. You can't just plug them in and make them as well, except you can. And I've done that on 2 different models. I did it on a Canon camcorder that had an HDMI output, which I then converted with an HDMI to USB adapter. And then another guy came in with a Sony camcorder that had an IEEE 1394 iLink DV output. And most computers today don't have DV inputs, except that Dell continued to include them on their laptops until quite recently. And I dug up a couple of old Dell laptops, and also I found some older machines that had FireWire inputs, and I discovered that I could get live video into certain models of laptops that had iLink input, and I got beautiful Zeiss optics with 300-to-1 zoom on a tripod with a remote control zoom, and this is salvation. Bringing a defunct system back to useful life, in this case, for hybrid meetings.
Right. I have a similar experience that I'm going through right now in my business. Someone brought in a mini DV tape and asked me to digitize it. Well, okay, so I have a bucket full of discarded camcorders, and I dug through it all and I found the one that I had, but I didn't have all of the cords necessary to connect its DV output up to anything I had on any of my computers in terms of DV inputs. So I talked with my son, who I knew had done this, and it turned out how he had done it was he took the DV output of the camcorder, which I imagine in its day was a very expensive one, but it's a piece of trash right now, and I plugged it into an old DVD writer that we had. So it would take the DV input, and then he took the analog outputs of that same device and fed those into a digitizer. So I went from digital to analog to digital again, and am able to actually give this person an MP3. And granted, the quality is some quality was lost, but not the entire quality of the thing that was just useless to them any other way. And I had a similar sort of salvation feeling about that.
You don't actually have to go back to analog. I found that I could, it turns out that Zoom, this Zoom application on Windows, can directly accept an iLink DV input right into Zoom. It had to be the version of Zoom that's on Windows, and it had to be running on a machine that had a DV input.
That I see what you're saying. Yep.
And
Well, to be honest with you, with that, I have no desire to make a big investment for this one DV tape that I have, mini DV tape that I have. So I'll probably, since the original is terrific, I'm not going to sacrifice that much in terms of going back to analog and then digitizing it again. But mum's the word on that, by the way.
So to tie it back to sci-fi, a lot of sci-fi is about the evolution of humans. How smart can we get, and how functional can we get, and what can you imagine in the future that's, more functional than a human being or more functional than a current computer? And the notion of salvation sort of fits into that. So a little bit of theology kind of sneaks into the cracks of these stories, which is, I think, one of the reasons that they're so charming, is that they don't do theology with theology. They do it with science fiction and aliens and other imaginary storybook characters that manifest these traits. So that's, I think, one of the charms of writing fantasy fiction and science fiction and allegories and parables, is that you can think about something in a different domain, a technology domain or a mathematical domain, and gain some insight that really applies to the human condition.
I think you could spend a lot of time on a treatise of the difference or lack thereof between science fiction and theology.
Yep. There's similarities and differences. One of the things that I like to do is look at similarities and differences between two things that seem to be separate domains. Where does the analogy work, and where does the analogy fall off the rails? And what's interesting is to focus on where the analogy works, where you get some insight.
Along those lines, a bit controversial, but there was a sci-fi writer who was widely held to be responsible for founding the Church of Scientology.
Oh, yeah.
And it started out as sci-fi, became religion.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, if you take the word theory, which is a perfectly valid word in science, the word theory in the Greek word is theoria. Theoria is a Greek word that means I behold. And of course, when you say I behold, it's I observe, I accept, or I embrace. And you can accept and embrace things which are science reality, and you can embrace and behold things which haven't happened yet but are possible. And the I behold, theoria, by the way, that's the same word as Torah. The Hebrew word for theory or science is Torah. And it's the same word as the Greek theoria, which means I behold. So these kind of fit together in a way that's a little bit surprising. And you can look back at the theologians, and they were the first systems thinkers, but they were systems thinking 3,500 years ago. So they didn't have the modern mathematics and the modern protocols of scientific method, but they were the pioneers. Ted has his hand up.
Yeah, I just think that one of the things that happens in all of this kind of literature is eventually it sinks to the level, or it rises to the level of the fundamentals of human nature. And I don't think we've changed all that much over thousands of generations. Maybe we're a little more subtle now than we used to be, perhaps, and that not every dispute ends up as somebody hitting the person on the head with a rock, as they did in the beginnings of 2001 there, but or a bone. But we ultimately, we metamorphose and we anthropomorphose, all these things that are just basically other manifestations of just ordinary human behavior. And the robots all become like humans eventually in all these science fiction stories that have robots in them. They're just better at throwing things and picking up things and stuff than we are, but maybe even computing than we are, but they're just still people. And ultimately it comes down to
That also true of the Terminator series, where the computers decide to precipitate nuclear war so they can get rid of the humans.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think so. And the same thing's true with many different genres of things. For instance, the famous Seven Samurai and the Magnificent Seven are the same movie, other than one is set in Japan and the other one is set in Mexico. That's
If you go back to that Foreman project clip with the inter-system language developed,
yeah.
that a common language, the two computers can speak the same language, that is the exact antithesis of the Tower of Babel story, where the human languages, we don't have a common language, that people think they're speaking a language like English or Greek or Latin or whatever. And in fact, it's not a consistent meaning across the communication channel. And I think that was a very interesting insight, that the computers were able to use mathematics as an inter-system language, and humans haven't got there because most people are not literate in mathematical languages. They're not conversant in math. And look at the science. Most of science is written in the language of mathematics, which most people can't decode. And that could be a future. Maybe our species will become fluent in math in the 21st century. Maybe the STEM disciplines will become part of the ABCs, or maybe we'll continue to communicate in languages where, like Harry said, at the end of a spoken sentence, nobody knows what he said or remembers what he said or could paraphrase what he said.
Well, what you're talking about, Barry, is something that's been in the news or been reported recently, is the erosion of liberal arts as a curricula in colleges, which I think is something that's, in my personal opinion, is not necessarily a good thing. I think as a culture, we need something like liberal arts to keep us sane. If everybody starts with ones and zeros, the world will evolve to be black and white. And we all know that gray is the predominant color.
I mean, Hofstadter says that this is an analog. This is an analogy machine. The humans are really good at analogies, metaphors and parables and analogies and allegories and poetry. And when it comes down to the mathematics, this gizmo, most people don't have a math coprocessor up here. So yeah, most literature is full of metaphors and analogies and allegories, and it's hard to decode them. I didn't read a lot of fiction because I couldn't decode the metaphors. There was no dictionary. Whereas the mathematics, you can say, okay, I can go back and find out what this symbol is supposed to mean. The definition is there, but you got to go back and do the.
Yeah, but you have to make a connection between the mathematics and the physical world.
Right.
And that's where it's all about analogies and metaphors and things like that. People are constantly trying to conceive of models that they can then use simple mathematics, because our mathematics is pretty primitive in many ways, to give us some understanding beyond the obvious. And you know, that's why we've fallen down on our faces many times with these theories, if you want to call them that persist for decades in many cases, that are just totally bogus because of the initial analogy that was used to couple the observations with their ideas of how to explain them. And that's why we give huge credit to people like Newton and Einstein and people like that for breaking us loose from common misconceptions. You know, Aristotle's common misconception, which was that you needed something to push something along, and Newton said, no, it's a natural property of things of inertia, that once it starts moving, it keeps on going on its own. You don't need a force acting on it, except when you're moving in a different direction or different speed. And then Einstein, you know, changed things, and now maybe we've found there may be some flaws, perhaps, in the very fundamental level of our understanding of gravity. That's a topic of popular discussion and science blogs and stuff in the last couple of months, that some measurements of some stars that are orbiting at very long distances may show differences from the predictions of Newtonian and Einsteinian gravity. But I think analogies are always our challenge. That's the thing. Going from data, you know, the IBM used to have a punchline for one of their commercials, and it said, "Not just data, but reality." And that's been the challenge always. You know, you can compute anything you want to, as long as you don't have to tie it to reality. You can be perfect.
So Ted, to respond to what you're saying, to me, it's and I'm going to use an analogy if you don't mind.
Yeah.
It's science is sort of like history. History is written by the victors.
Yeah.
Science is also written by the victors. You don't learn a lot about all those people who made tons of mistakes getting from point A to point B that incrementally advanced what was going on to get to the final realization where we are today. There's all those little people, and I say that in quotes because they probably weren't.
Mm-hmm.
There's all those little people that made small incremental changes that sort of got people thinking in a different way, et cetera, that finally got to the point where we are today. And Einstein comes up with his great theories, and all the other, Newton comes up with their theories. All these people we read about today learn from the mistakes of the people that came before them. And we don't know about those people necessarily without doing a lot of digging.
Yeah, there was a great TV series that was run on PBS called Connections. Anybody remember Connections with James Burke?
Yeah.
He would pick some initial thing that seemed to have no relationship to the final product, and then show you how it
Napoleon invade Russia.
Yeah, right. Or the stirrup at the Battle of Hastings or something like this, and the nuclear weapon, you know, and how that had happened. And you see the connections go along. But the problem with that thing I always had problems with was that there are multiple possible paths. He just chose one particular path, maybe because he thought it was most profound or most likely or whatever, but there were multiple possible paths. You could have found out different ways to get to the final product that had no relationship whatsoever with the connections he chose. And classic examples, of course, are multiple people who come to the same conclusion that one gets credit for as a great invention or something, and the other person who's obscure and unknown comes up with it independently.
Anyone who has a narrative has to be falsifying. All narratives are false in some degree.
I just wanted to clarify about James Burke connections. The reason why he said, why he presented things the way he did was that he said that if technology arrived at a certain point, certain discoveries, certain innovations were practically inevitable, and it didn't matter who was there. Anyone with the right training, education in that environment at that time would probably have come up with the same thing or something similar. That's what his thesis was. That has been argued pro and con.